Hey there, C-Sharpers. My name's Matthew. I'm the C-Sharp Artisan, and this is the 12th and last video in my series on Azure Service Bus. And today, we're going to talk about how Azure Service Bus and Azure Functions relate, how they come together. So what's Azure Functions? As you may know, Azure Functions is the Azure Serverless compute paradigm. Well, there's a buzzword. So what does that mean? Basically, the idea with serverless compute is you can set up some code that's going to execute as a result of some event, some conditions. Basically, it's going to come into being. That class will come into being. It'll run and do its job and then go away. And you don't have to mess about configuring virtual machines or configuring applications or configuring Docker containers or Kubernetes or all these other kind of deployment and hosting mechanisms. You just deploy your code and configure it, and the Azure Functions runtime does all that other stuff in the background for you. And you can set up scale conditions. So if your app goes under a lot of load and you all of a sudden need 200 copies of your function, great. It'll scale up and create all those instances. So it's a nice paradigm. And the key is to understand the various triggers, the kind of events or conditions that cause an Azure function to come into being and do its job. So this isn't an in-depth tutorial on Azure Functions, but it's good to have a little context. So for example, you can write an Azure function that is triggered by a REST API call. So a client issues a GET or a PUT or a POST, and that causes your Azure function to run. You can have an Azure function that responds to a timer event. So you can set a timer trigger. And there are actually quite a few different triggers. So in our case, what we're looking at is an Azure Service Bus Queue trigger. So what that means is when a message goes into the queue that our function is bound to, the function comes into being, receives the message, and does something. So this is an alternative way of making another kind of service bus receiver that will get messages and process them. So here we go. Azure Service Bus Queues as the trigger for binding an Azure function. Say that 7 times fast. So here we are in Visual Studio. And as you can see, I have no project or solution open at all. We're just going to start from scratch. And the Visual Studio wizards are really helpful for this kind of work. So we'll say File, New, Project. And I'm going to choose the Azure Functions type of project. And I'm going to give it this name, Artisan Test Function Queue. And it'll have the same solution name. That's just fine. And now we have to make some choices. So the most important thing here is that you're going to choose .NET 8 isolated long-term support. So what is this whole isolated versus not isolated? So until recently, Azure Functions worked sitting on top of what's called the Web Jobs framework. And they're changing it now so that they kind of spin up in their own processes so that they're isolated. You can read all about this. I'm not sure I fully understand all the changes, but what I did see is that the in-process way of hosting these is going away, that they're going to deprecate it. So any new code should be using isolated. So we're going to choose that. And then there are different trigger types. These are all these different triggers that I kind of talked about before. And we're going to use the Service Bus Queue trigger. So this is a bit mysterious. So you may recall that when we were creating Service Bus clients, we needed to authenticate. And we've been using a connection string. So this is going to follow that same pattern. And we can call this whatever we want. I'm just going to call it conster. And then we do have to get the queue name right. And our queue is called test Q1. So with these choices made, once we click Create, Visual Studio is going to do an awful lot of work for us that is very helpful. Now, this video is being recorded in late September 2024. This particular area has been very dynamic, and so who knows, a year from now, these wizards and techniques may have changed, but at least for now, this does a lot of good stuff for us. So I'm just going to let it kind of spool up and get everything going, and now we can go ahead and build this solution. So there's a lot going on here, but basically you can see it has created this thing called Function 1, and we could rename that if we want. We don't really have to. And this method has been decorated here with this attribute, which will allow the Azure Functions to bind to it. And then this method right here has all of these attributes on it, right? These actually, this is binding the parameters. So it's telling us that this is going to be a service bus trigger, looking for something called test Q1, so you can see where our values went in, and binding a connection whose connection string is stored in a setting called conster. All right, so this is the first thing that we need to deal with. So when we debug this locally, we need it to be able to pick that up. So I've got it over here. We can just copy and paste it. So now what you've got is that value in my local settings, so that when we debug this locally in kind of the simulated host, it'll pick that up. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to tweak a few of these things. So we have been using subjects in our messages. And so we can call this message.subject. And we've been using bodies, but they are binary encoded. And we've also been using correlation ID. So rather than type all this again, I just have it here ready to go. So I'm going to replace their default stuff with something I like a little better. Okay, so now we're going to get the subject, the body, and the correlation ID logged out. And you'll notice that one of our input parameters is this thing called Service Bus Message Actions. So this is the thing that allows us to complete or abandon or dead letter the message. So the fact that we're getting that tells you something very important, that this method, this whole thing is using the peak lock way of receiving. So we went over that in an early video, but the whole receive and delete mechanism isn't really there. It uses peak locks. Now, there is an autocomplete setting which will call this for you, but it is still using peak lock, so you don't get to choose. Okay, so this run method becomes our receiver, and it should execute every time a message goes into the queue. So I'm going to set a breakpoint there, and I'm actually just going to start this running. And what it's going to do, it's set up to host it locally for debug purposes. And it's going to bring up a console window. And it says that it found some configuration and it's wiring things up. Let's just let it go. All right. And I think, yes, now it's ready and it should be listening. So I've got my magic service bus sender, which sends messages into that test queue. So let's go here and just tell it to send one message, and let's see what happens. All right, and it starts logging some things, and now our breakpoint hits. So we could now debug this if we wanted to. I'm just going to clear the breakpoint, and let it continue. And you can see it logged out subject, correlation ID, and the body was message 1. So let's just, for fun, let's hit it with 3 more messages. And there they are. Message 1, message 2, and message 3. So this is now running in a little local test harness, which is great. Lets you develop and debug. But of course, what we really want to do is host this on Azure. So publishing functions, publishing anything to Azure is a bit of a process. And that is probably worth a whole other series of videos. But for this one, we're just going to take advantage of because we're not in Git or source control, and we're not doing continuous deployment, or we're not using any declarative kind of infrastructure, infrastructure as code kind of tools. We just are going to use the publish wizard, and it's going to do the right thing. So I'm going to right click here, and I'm going to choose publish. And we want to target Azure. And we're going to do this as a Windows-based Azure Function app. And it's connected to my Azure subscription, and it's seeing some stuff that I've already got going here. Like this is another function that I've got up and running. But I want to create a new one. So let's create a new function instance. And I'm going to give it, whoops, not that name. I want to give it, okay, how can I copy and paste this name? Let's see, I know where I've got it. We'll come back to this in just a moment. I just want to use this name because it's going to help me filter later. So I'm going to call it Azure Test Function Queue. It'll be in this subscription. I'm going to put it in my resource group 1 consumption plan. I would not like it to be in Australia. I'm going to put it in West US, and this can all be fine. Yeah, App Insights. I've got, again, this isn't a tutorial on publishing to Azure. I'm not really an expert in that anyway, but I think these settings are going to work. So let's create our new resource here. And it is creating this little app service. So this is creating, you're going to see, it's going to create what's called an Azure Functions application. Okay, so it took a while. It finally completed. I cropped out that extra minute of dead air time so you didn't have to just sit there. And now I'm going to click Finish. And it's creating what's called a publication profile, which will be this pub XML file. All right, it's done. So we can say close. And now we've got our publish profile set up. I'll click Publish. And again, this might take a little while, so if it goes on, I will snip out a little of the video so we all don't have to just sit here. Okay, so the publication succeeded. So it should be now up on Azure. And we can go look by going here to the Azure portal. And let me just refresh this query. And now it shows up. And we can click on this. And if we look at the overview, we can see this is our function app called Artisan Test Func Queue, and it has this function here, which is enabled. So the last thing we'll need to do is give it that setting. So if we look under Settings and Environment Variables, here are our app settings. We can add a new one, and we're going to name it Conster. And I'm going to go on over to my other screen here. I'm going to grab that connection string and say apply and confirm. Great. And we'll go to our overview, and I'm actually going to restart the app here just to be sure. Okay, so the app has restarted, and you will notice there was another splice there. So what I was doing was waiting a little bit for the app to spool up and then sending a few messages through just to make sure that this is really working. There is some lag time when you restart these functions, and sometimes they will be working, but the app insights log doesn't show what it's doing, and that's what I want to show you. So we're going to go to the log stream here, and we'll let it connect. And then once it's connected, I'm going to bring up my magic message sender again, and let's just send it a message and see what happens. Okay, so our code ran. Here it is, subject, body, and correlation ID. And we can go ahead and for fun, we can send it another 3. And there's message 1, message 2, message 3. So we've deployed our code to Azure. Hooray! That wasn't that hard. Okay, right before the end of this video, right before I sign off, I want to just show you one other thing that you can do here. And this is really going to tie it back to some of the earlier videos. So let us look at our function. And what I'm going to show you is that there is another method signature here that you can use for this run method. And I've got a copy over here. I just want to make sure I get it right. So in this attribute, if we say is batched equals true, then this is going to give us a multi-message receiver. And so the service bus message is going to be an array. It'll be messages, and we're going to need a loop. So I'm just going to copy this and we'll put this inside the loop. So what's happening here is we're getting an array of messages. And you know what? Let's also log one other thing. We'll log out the number of messages we received. So we're going to receive an array of messages, loop through them, and then do the same thing. So this should look familiar to you. We have a video early on where we build a service bus receiver that receives multiple messages, and also a service bus processor that can receive multiple messages. So the one thing you may remember is that you need to be able to say how many is the max number of messages you want to receive. And the way we do that here is we can put some stuff in this host.json that controls our bindings. And so again, I'm just going to, in the interest of time, we're going to copy and paste. So these are the service bus extensions. So I'm going to say max message batch size of 10. So this is equivalent to when we do the service bus receiver and we pass in that first parameter, which is the max number of messages to receive. And there is this autocomplete messages setting. I just wanted to show it to you. We're actually just going to set it to false. But if you set it to true, then you don't have to, then basically you don't get to complete or dead letter your messages. But in this case, I kind of like having control over that. So here we go. Let's build that. Make sure it builds. And I'm going to go ahead and once it's built, I'm going to publish it and refresh. I'll come back in just a second once all of that's done and we can test it real quick. Okay, our app published to Azure, and here we are back in the log stream window. And what I'm going to do is just send it some messages. Now, I told it it could do 10 at a time. So why don't we send it something like, I don't know, let's send it 14 messages and see what happens. Okay, so what you're going to notice is at first we got one message, and then we got 3, and then we got 3 more, and then we got 4 more, and then 3 more. So it didn't ever come close to giving us 10. When we built the Service Bus receiver, where we were specifying that number of max messages, it often got really close to that. Those batches, if the messages were available in the queue, it filled up the max. That is not the behavior I've seen here with these that are being invoked as Azure Functions. But if you stop and think about it, one of your design reasons for using Azure Functions is to allow it to scale horizontally, which means you're actually going to potentially have quite a few parallel receivers. So that creates an interesting kind of problem when you're doing batches, but multiple receivers doing batches. So you just kind of got to think through exactly what the patterns and activities are that you want and what makes sense for horizontal scaling. Okay, I think we're done. That's 12 videos. This one's gone on a little long. And I just want to say, if you've made it all the way through the tutorial series, congratulations and thank you very much. If you've liked these videos and enjoyed them, please do like them on YouTube. Please send me your comments. Please subscribe to the channel. I love getting new subscribers. And I really hope this has been a useful resource for you. So until we start our next series, stay sharp.